believe the lady who's been involved with the project. I'm going to call him the town engineer, and he can give the report as basis. We did look a copy of this. We were provided with these at our last meeting. We had some questions, but once we hear the report again, I got to make sure I don't lose the question. Okay. So, Bob, if you want to, Manny, do you want to give us what you would like to
sure.
give us?
I don't know what format you'd like us to discuss it.
It's whatever you...
Okay. Well, you all have a copy of this, the most recent report that we've done. Okay. Kathy certainly was the primary author of this report. It documents what ended up being 4 rounds of sampling, okay, that were done on the site. The results have all been consistent, okay. Those results have been reviewed and discussed with the regulatory agencies, with New York State DEC, a gentleman by the name of Stan Radon, okay. And he has sent us essentially 2 letters, once acknowledging receipt of the report, but the site did not qualify for any program that the state runs. That was we got a second virtually identical letter. I believe it was the 24th of June, stating the same conclusion after they have read and reviewed this current version of the report. So with that, I'll certainly turn it over to Kathy. Kathy Galante is a senior environmental scientist at GHD. She's been doing this for a good number of years, dozens of projects with her experience, and she will go through and give you kind of a summation of the report, results of the report, and then answer any questions that either the Environmental Commission has or the town board for that matter, whoever would like to answer any questions.
All right, before she gives it the report, understand that there wasn't one member of this board. I think Mr. Guyman heard this last month when we were here. There wasn't one member of this board who was jumping up and down with a negative feeling or recommendation saying we were against the park. And we got some information back from others saying that they felt that we were just picking on either the engineer or on the town board for bringing this riverfront park site on our agenda. We've been looking at this for 2 years, all right? So we've had a lot of discussions about it. We're very concerned that the population of the people who use this park will not have a problem using the park. As far as the value of having a town park on Pletcher Road, or Pletcher Road and River Road for the town with a waterfront, I think the whole total board was in favor of that type of a site. Second, personally, it's near my property, and I believe, I even stated this last month, I believe that that affects my property, having a beautiful town park there. So I would not be against it jumping up and down. We're questioning the value of what you're doing and eliminating any question about the site having waste or chemicals or problems for future families to use that park. That's all we've questioned, all right? And it was because of the former burial site on that piece of property, of which that's what you've been testing. I believe that's what the town board has asked you to do all this testing, and I think they've done 3 or 4 sites. It's cost them X amount of money extra because we're trying to make sure that the site is pure, that there will not be a future problem. I just want to make sure that we say that for the record. Would you please give us the rest of your evaluation in the summary?
Sure. So back in last summer, I think it was July or August of 2018, we went out and, well, you know, Bob came to me and said, we have this piece of property in the town. They want to put a park. You know, what should we do? And it's like, well, okay, it has a history of dewatering lagoons. So at that point in time, we really didn't have any idea as to where exactly the lagoons were. So we went out and we did a dozen borings across the property, kind of on a staggered grid pattern, to get a general characterization to see what we would find. Number one, see if we could locate lagoons. Secondly, see, get a, a snapshot of soil chemistry. So we did that. We went out, we did 12 borings. We did boreholes depths to anywhere from 8 to, I think, 11 feet. Took soil samples, sent the samples to the laboratory, and results came back, again, very, very, you're going to have chemistry no matter where you are. Low levels across the board with the exception of arsenic. That was kind of the primary contaminant that we had higher levels with. So with that data, we did an additional 5 samples at borehole locations that had elevated arsenic, and we took the soil samples from the 0 to 2 foot kind of surface contact zone. That's really what you are primarily concerned with. You want to ensure that if anybody's going to come in contact with the soil, there's not going to be, that's where they're going to be. They're not going to be digging 6 foot holes. It's going to be that top surface. So we took those additional samples, and out of the 5 locations, I believe it was 3 that came back below the state criteria for arsenic. Again, with 2 locations, that is manageable. You can manage it through the design, either through cover, 2 feet of clean soil brought to the site. You can manage that through construction of, like a concrete slab for a pavilion or a parking area, something like that. Once we had those results from those first 2 rounds of sampling, we summarized that, and we had a discussion with the DEC and said, this is what we did, this is what we found. And they said, well, we actually have some additional information that they had found going through their files, which showed the dimensions of the former settling lagoons, and those in relation to a couple of the manholes that were out on the property. So we took those, the drawing that they had, and we went back out to the site, and we surveyed everything, made sure that we could match up the locations with those manholes and our sampling locations, because right now everything was, we had 2 separate grids essentially, that we had to now marry. So when we did that, we found that borehole location 8 and 9, one was in the East Lagoon, one was in the West Lagoon. And we went back to the agency and said, well, we did what you asked, and we do have 2 boreholes within the lagoons. And after discussions with them, we went back out and did a 3rd round to take some additional surface soil samples within those 2 lagoons. Again, nothing was, I think after that 3rd round, everything was pretty consistent within the 0 to 2 foot. Presented that to the town board back in, I don't remember when it was, February.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was earlier this year. And based on some of the comments and concerns that the board had, we went out and did a 4th round of sampling, did 6 additional boreholes, 2 within the locations of the former lagoons and the river, and then 2 more within each lagoon. Again, results were consistent with what we had found previously, with, again, the only compound that exceeded state criteria was arsenic. We did find 1 additional location within the 0 to 2 feet that would have to be managed, and that was within the East Lagoon, where we already had a location. So again, it's just something that has to be, it can be managed within the design. As far as the lagoons and the material that was placed there, I guess there's some question as to, what that was, where it came from. And after reviewing the historical information for this, the divers' reports from, what they observed within the river bottom, the pipe, it's essentially river sediment that had been drawn in from use of that, those pipes for, 30 years as intakes. That material was taken, flushed out of there, placed within the lagoons for dewatering. It wasn't a matter of the material being hazardous. They had taken some samples back in the late 70s when they did that. A couple of the tests that they did don't really mean much by today's standards, but looking at that data from back then, there really was not much, I mean, they had some low levels of, I think it was lindane or, yeah, a low-level pesticide. And again, a low-level PCB that by today's standards would be, you know, below the criteria that we would have to meet. We did not see any of that in any of the samples that we did. And again, like I say, the only thing that we saw was arsenic, which, you know, quite honestly, for Niagara County is pretty much everywhere, based on the agricultural history of the county. So it's not something that we were, you know, surprised to find there. So that was essentially, you know, we've done 4 rounds of sampling. The data has all been pretty consistent between the rounds. You know, I don't have any, there's nothing out there that would, you know, indicate that there's a larger problem. If we would have found, you know, chlorinated organics, you know, volatiles, something else, we would have definitely done more delineation to try to find that. We didn't find anything. There's nothing there. So that's essentially that. You know, that's essentially the, you know, the history of the investigations.
Is it your recommendation, in the report, I thought I read this, that it's possible to remove some of that material from those, let's say, areas and replace it with clean fill, or is that?
It could be done. It doesn't have to be done. It could either be, that could be done, that's an option. It could be removed.
I'm not looking for added expense,
Yeah.
but in other words, didn't you sort of suggest that in the report?
I didn't necessarily suggest it, but it was mentioned as an option. It could be removed, it could be managed on site.
And to do that, we'd be talking about, it's removing it, the material for arsenic purposes. In other
Correct.
words, that's the only reason that that would be considered.
Correct.
That's what I thought. Okay.
What would you be doing to manage that?
Cover.
Pardon?
Cover.
Cover only?
The only thing you're looking to do, and the way the state regs are written, you know, for a park, this park more or less, if it's walking trails, you know, maybe a picnic table, pavilion, something like that. You know, there was talk of having a kayak launch down by the river and having river access, and I think that was more or less the, you know, the bigger issue with it. But that would all be passive recreational activities. So passive recreational, you're required to meet the commercial standards for the state. Active recreation is where you have something more like ball diamonds, where people are really going to be down and playing in the dirt and, you know, a lot of soil contact. As a conservative measure, we went with active recreation, which you then have to meet a more stringent state standard, which is the restricted residential criteria. Either way, with the exception of arsenic, we meet those criteria. Now, questions have come up, you know, in terms of the DEC, and their letter is a little, you know, somewhat ambiguous, but bottom line, the only way they really weigh in and will give you a full review and a you know, certificate of completion or no further action is if a site is in a state program. What they're telling us is there's nothing here that would qualify this site to be in a state program. So, you know, we've done multiple rounds of testing. We have not found anything that would indicate that there is a greater issue there.
All right, the final design of the park, when I say final design, has not been done,
No.
completed.
No.
So at this point, the recommendations from the engineer would be that this particular site where the boring was done should be covered, correct? And when I say covered, it could be a pad, it could be something else,
It could
correct?
be additional clean fill brought and placed over just one particular location where we saw arsenic, and or let's just face it, for example, a concrete pad for a pavilion. Okay, all of that would be subject to the final design, with that, you know, being the end result there. So either a concrete pad, additional fill, depending upon where we like to put the pavilion.
Would it be the engineer's recommendation also that there shouldn't be a lot of construction going on this, on the park grounds. In other words, we're happy with, let's say, what's been done to date to check the soil, all right? That doesn't mean we're not, I don't want to say it, we're not sure what's there altogether. All I'm saying is that if we found whatever the problem was, we're covering it with, as you described, the pads. I don't look like we're gonna have a road all the way through the park that would necessitate digging up material to put a road in. Do you understand what I'm saying?
In other words, you're asking if there's gonna be a lot of construction that's gonna be like
Yes,
intrusive, disturbing everything,
Right.
and I wouldn't think so.
I mean, addition of a road, some foundation for some pavilions, but those are very small, very localized. So in terms of active construction on the site, that won't be much.
Yeah. Is anyone familiar, I guess, if anyone's familiar with Wilkeson Point, which is a park down in the Buffalo waterfront, kind of at the foot of the Skyway. I don't know if you're, it was, again, reclaimed land. It was land that was all, built by, filling out into the lake. And then there was a lot of industrial activity out there. Well, they took that and they turned that into a park about 10 years ago. Chemistry-wise, it's got a lot more going on than anything that we would see here. What they did though, they built some large mounds, they have some trails walking up it, so it's a big observation point. So you get to the top, you can look out over the lake. They've got some other areas where they kind of incorporated it into landscaping. They've got a big meadow area that they didn't have to do anything with. That's where they have their picnic tables, and it's just a matter of how you manage the different areas.
So there is a proper way, again, that the town board will look at to manage the site as far as not having a lot of construction, whatever, and trying to make it fit the needs of the public.
Yes.
That's all I'm asking. You had a question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would be concerned about the need for light poles, where you have to, sink something down, fence posts, anything where you would be required to go down into the soil. Would they be precluded? You'd not be
No.
able to?
No, because again, the concentrations, you just take that soil and you would take it and, again, manage what you remove. If it's in an area that, we've identified as one of these, arsenic hotspots, I'll say, that material would have to either then be covered under 2 feet of clean fill. But otherwise, the site itself, certainly the borings that we did on the last two, between the lagoons and the river, there's absolutely nothing. They meet the unrestricted standards. This isn't a big chemical soup. It's a very, other than, like I say, the arsenic, which again is, I think from, a lot of past agricultural use in the area, really nothing there.
No, I understand the sewer department forever will have to have access to that building. Is that correct?
Yes, to the
Yeah.
tunnels, yeah. Not necessarily the building, what's underneath the building.
Okay, what would prevent leaching going into the 2-story basement that's in that building?
There's nothing to leach.
None of this, these
You're
chemicals?
you're not at those levels. You are not there. This is very, very low level.
And surface drainage would be toward the north and then west?
Yeah.
North to the Tennessee gas line area?
Yeah, if that's kind of the low spot along the
And-
north boundary and then toward the river.
So-
And again, there's nothing, this is not, you don't have a lot of runoff. It's,
That was really one of the questions I guess we heard 2 or 3 times in the 2 years we talked about. Was there runoff from all these years from, let's say, whatever the chemical base might have been, into the river going down? And you did borings along the river and back to make sure that wasn't happening, correct?
and there's no, you're not gonna, it's a field. You're really not gonna have a lot of runoff. It's a pervious surface. All your rainfall is essentially gonna infiltrate. You're gonna have maybe some spongy ground, but you're not gonna have runoff after a storm.
How did the engineer determine the 2-foot rule? This is a question came up at our meeting last month. No depth below for the park.
2-foot rule?
Yeah,
What
there
we're,
was no depth below for the, in other words, somewhere in the report it was saying that much of it was 2 feet determined because that's what the park was gonna be.
No, again, that comes from the state, from the state regulations.
Oh, I'm
The 0 to
sorry.
2 foot,
Yeah.
the 0 to 2 foot zone is that contact zone. So you can, if you have chemistry at a site, and depending on levels, you can have chemistry above the criteria below 2 feet, as long as you have a 2-foot clean buffer.
It
So,
just, there was a
and that's
question,
where,
yeah.
that's where the 2 feet comes in.
Do you have
I don't wanna,
do you have any idea of the percentage of the lagoon area as to the total? The 2 lagoon
No.
areas, what the percentage would be?
I mean, the dimensions are.
20%, 25% of the land of the lot?
More dimensions. I mean, that's actually to scale, so. It's probably about from when you go down the hill from the, that maintenance building, it might be maybe, 25 to 30% of that property.
anything else?
Good.
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question on the sampling that you did. In your report, it said that you did a homogenized sample.
Yes.
Now, what would be the difference if you did discrete throughout that?
Minimal. Now, in our reasoning for doing, for doing that, we screen with instrumentation to see if we have any volatiles. We do a visual review to see if there's anything that's inconsistent with surrounding soils. When we're out in the field, are there any odors? Is there any staining? We're looking for all these cues. In the absence of that, we really have no clear indication as to say sample at 4 foot or sample at 7 foot.
Right.
So we take a composite.
All right. If, in doing that, how confident are you of the percentage that you come up with? There was some arsenic that came up almost double what is permissible. And how would that change? I mean, like,
Minimal. And that's another reason why we took and we sampled the top 2 feet. That's why we're looking at that surface zone to see what are people coming in contact with.
so the next thing is if it should be even a little bit higher, how would that affect impact your decision on how to cover? Would be basically the same.
Yes. Anything else?
No, that would be it.
All right, the town board is here, and you have, certainly I want to give you the opportunity before I call, I think we have 2 people, citizens here, who might want to say something. I call on the town board first. Do you have any additional questions generated? I know you've heard the report 5 times, but in case you had anything.
Well, Kathy presented to us recently, and that was the second time. She did ask a lot of questions. Yes.
Okay, and you were here for one of our meetings.
Yes.
In so many meetings, I forget, but I remember both of you were here, and we appreciated that. I'll call on the audience because we do have these 2 people here. Yes?
I'm just going to give you a copy of one of the DEC charts that'll show you the difference between the restricted and unrestricted detection levels. I've got a lot of questions, so in the interest of time, what I'd like to do is read through all the questions, and if you want to answer some tonight, great. If you'd rather go back and look at the report and respond later, presuming that if the questions are deemed reasonable and substantive and useful to the board's deliberations, hopefully give me time to, reasonable amount of time to digest your answers before the board meets. So I'll just run through the questions once, and then if you'd like a second time, one at a time, just so you know where I'm going here. The report was certified, but by an engineer not previously involved in the project, so I'd like to know who Mr. Snyder is, and it would be great, Kathy, if we could get any information on your background and experience. As you know, the Department of Health is required to sign off on brownfields program reports, along with DEC, which I think was appropriate given the difference in their mission. I think that was wise of the state legislature to do. But to the extent, since you didn't certify the report, your name appears nowhere in the report, we could have some information on your background, that would be terrific, and your whatever certifications you have. The round one misses in the first round of sampling. As you know, only 2 of the 12 borings were in the lagoons. So I wondered whether or not someone visually inspected the site prior to sampling, because the lagoon it does appear to be elevated and quite visible. I'm wondering why, since in June, more than a month before the sampling, GHD didn't go to DEC Permit Administration for a copy of the burial plans, which I specified in an email to Bob that they supervised and permitted the burial. I also, in the report, was kind of stunned that it stated in 1978, the town engineering report, in your view, said that, quote, only PCB and mercury detections exceed current criteria, especially when mercury was detected back then at levels 10 to 15 times the current regulatory threshold. The other important thing to remember is the contaminants looked for in 1978 were limited and excluded things like arsenic. And if we didn't know where the burial was for round one, why in the first round of sampling were the 2 samples taken and the burial footprint composited differently from most of the samples taken from outside the footprint. The composite sampling is quite dilutive in the view of academics who teach engineers how to do sampling plans and do the analysis. Also in the view of the Department of Health, of Stan Radon's predecessors who are retired, and some other engineering firms that I spoke with. So why we know that mercury was 10 to 15 times higher than what you found, why we think discrete sampling would be no different than composite sampling is something that from the explanation tonight doesn't seem substantiated. And if we know what the depth of that burial was, why the composite was so deep and so diluted. The highest detections for mercury were in the burial subsurface and in the 2 quote-unquote surface, and I use the top 2 feet very loosely when I say surface, because that's another concern. It's still dilutive of any detections there. We're located between the burial and the river. They were 5 to 10 times higher than the mercury in the rest of the site, and there was in fact a mercury detection, or both of the borings between the lagoons and the river were at or exceeded the unrestricted level for mercury. So again, I ask why GHD did not take discrete samples in these areas to determine if mercury is A, elevated, B, leaching to the river or the Stella Preserve wetlands, which Lewiston shares according to the wetlands map in the Greenway application that GHD prepared, or C, prone to therefore leach again if covered with soil, which is not even contemplated at this juncture in terms of the mercury. The highest diluted detections for arsenic were in the burial subsurface in the lagoons. Why would we not take discrete instead of diluted samples for arsenic to determine if arsenic is further elevated or prone to leach again into the surface area if just covered over with soil is the remedy. There are additional diluted arsenic detections above unrestricted use not listed on the report map. The highest diluted detections for PCBs were in the burial footprint and also SP16, SP18, and also SP8, right on the northern edge, and all exceeded the threshold for unrestricted use. Again, why no discrete sampling to determine the real concentration? And why was no groundwater sampling undertaken given identified subsurface contamination in permit documents as well as the diluted samples taken? You know, is that heard of? Because I haven't found anyone in an agency nor seen any investigations myself where that's the case. I'm more than halfway through and the rest will go more quickly. The GHD rep on site for borings for the logs was Alexandra Gearing. What I found on the internet suggests she's part of the trade association for junior staff members in the practice areas of water and sewer, not brownfields investigations. So I'd like to know if that's a correct summary, and was there anyone else from GHD on the site at the time the borings were taken to do the visual and check for the odors. The logs we do have were not completely filled out. Please note specifically SB15, it was quite unusual, and it seems inconsistent with other information on the forms. No discrete sampling, mercury, PCBs, arsenic was done within the burial as mapped, and again, why wasn't this undertaken? The SB14 log notes high moisture in the southwest corner of Lewiston property. As I said earlier, the Greenway application met wetlands on the south side of the burial. You can visibly see the other half on the northwest part of the Conservancy property. There were no borings done on the south side of the burial, yet borings were done along the very edge of the north border, so it would be helpful to understand why that was the case. There were no logs for the second and third rounds of sampling, as limited as they were in the top 2 feet. Why? And there was no sampling and analysis plan prepared in advance of round 1, round 2, round 3, or round 4 sampling before field work was conducted, and this was not provided to the board or the Environmental Commission. So I'm wondering why that's customary. And on the 4th round of sampling, the only thing that was provided to the board was a new map with the 6 extra dots for the new boring locations on the map, and the board was told it was prepared just hours before the vote. Again, why not available to the Environmental Commission for review prior to the field work, particularly given some